Welcome back to the channel, Book Dragons. I'm so glad you joined me today. I'm going to talk to you about my journey reading Stephen King. As we all know, Stephen King is an extremely popular author. So many people are constant readers of his and love everything he's written. My journey has been a little rockier than that. It's kind of complicated. So we're going to talk about that today. And I'm going to put my eyes on here because I want to tell you about the four ways I'm going to break this video down. We're going to talk about the books that I've liked. We're going to talk about the books that I've struggled with. And then we're going to talk about the books I want to read. And then we're going to talk about some maybes, some books that I'm kind of on the fence about. But I will say right from the beginning that I am not one of those people that is probably going to read everything Stephen King has written. Now, I could be wrong. One of these days I may decide, I'm just going to read everything that Stephen King has written. But I don't think so. So let's get right to it. We'll talk about the books that I've liked. I have not read that many Stephen King books to begin with. In my limited experience, these are the books that have really resonated with me. The first one of those is Salem's Lot. That is my absolute favorite Stephen King novel so far. I love a good vampire tale, and I love how that's kind of his take on Dracula, like a modern day Dracula. And it was just fantastic. Everything about that book just really worked for me. It was fast-paced, it was well-written, well-plotted, the characters were really interesting to me, especially Kurt Barlow's character I thought was quite well done. So yeah, that book just really was the cream of the crop for me as far as what Stephen King has written. Now, a close second to that is The Shining. I recently read The Shining in October of 2024, and wow, guys, that book really surprised me. I wasn't sure what I was going to think of it, but I really quite enjoyed it. And again, it was fast-paced. The characters were really interesting, especially Jack's character, and I just found myself having a hard time putting that book down. And that's what I want from a book. And again, these are books that are 600-700 pages. They're not super long. And so that is a perfect length for me even. And then, of course, I've read the Dark Tower series, the entire Dark Tower series. While The Gunslinger was not my favorite book, it was my least favorite of the Dark Tower series. The entire Dark Tower series overall was fantastic. Yeah, there were points where it got a little weird with some very fourth wall breaking meta type stuff, but it was fine. It worked in the story, even though it was a little bit of an odd choice. And I know the Dark Tower is kind of his magnum opus. It's what almost everything in his Kingverse connects to. And so I'm really curious to find other connections and learn more about that, some of the lore behind it. And I know there are other books that do that as well, and I've read some of them. Salem's Lot, for instance, connects directly to Book 5 of the Dark Tower. And I really enjoyed seeing those connections. And I would probably go back and do a reread of The Gunslinger now that I've finished the series, because there are things that happen in the Dark Tower book that tie directly back into The Gunslinger. And so I think I might enjoy my reread a little bit more than I did the initial read of it. So we'll see. I might go back and reread The Gunslinger. I don't know if I'll reread the entire series, maybe, but it is a series that is worthwhile rereading, in my opinion. It would be something that I would reread. Let's talk about some of the books I struggled with. And the first one is It. I had an extremely difficult time even getting into it. I got through the first 200 pages and I was convinced I was going to DNF the book. It was just way too wordy, way too overwritten. It took way too long to get going. And the only thing that saved me was a friend who recommended I read the audiobook instead. And so I picked up the audiobook and I made it through. It was still a chore, but I made it through. I think I ended up giving it like 2 or 3 stars. It just wasn't great for me at all. But I'm glad I read the story. Everybody talks about the scene at the end of it that's really off-putting, and it is. It just didn't need to be there. It's definitely a book that I would not reread. We'll put it that way. The other book on this list that I've struggled with is The Stand. I also did that one on audiobook because I knew The Stand was a chunker. And for me, Stephen King chunkers don't work very well. He seems to struggle keeping a consistent pace in his longer books. So I don't think that I'll be looking to read a lot of his longer books because of that. But I did want to read The Stand. I was very curious. I knew that The Stand tied in a little bit to The Dark Tower. Not nearly as much as Salem's Lot does, but it does tie in. And so I wanted to read that story. And I'm glad I read it, but it dragged so bad. Some people told me that I should have read the original version of The Stand before King put out his author's edition that has all the extended scenes and additions. So maybe I should have, but I'm not going to bother reading it now. I've already read the version that's his preferred edition. I'm not going to bother going back and reading the other one. I got enough from what I read. I was familiar with The Stand. I had watched a TV miniseries back in the 90s, and so I was familiar with the story, but I didn't remember a whole lot. But as I was reading the book, I'm like, okay, yeah, I kind of remember this from the miniseries I watched, and the ending was just really lackluster for me. And as I said, pacing was a really big issue in the book. I figured I just won't ever read it again, but I'm glad I read it. So now let's move on to the books that I want to read, okay? And I've got a list of several books here that I do want to read. The first one is Misery. I have not read Misery. It is high priority on my list, partly because it's the favorite Stephen King book of my youngest child. I can't not read my youngest child's favorite book. So I do want to read it. I've seen the movie. I have not seen the director's cut that is supposedly closer to the book, but I saw the original theatrical cut, and I really enjoyed the movie. So I think I will probably enjoy the book, and it is one of Stephen King's shorter books, so that's a plus, right? I also want to read Dr. Sleep. Of course, it's the sequel to The Shining, and we're following Danny as a middle-aged man, and it's really intriguing to me. And then, of course, I'll probably watch the movie as well, because I did watch the movie of The Shining after reading The Shining. That was not a great experience, but the at least the book was good. But with Dr. Sleep, I'm very curious to read the book, because Stephen King is not known to do a lot of sequels. With the exception of the Dark Tower series, he usually writes standalones. So I'm very curious to see what he does with a sequel to The Shining. The Institute is another one, and I don't know a whole lot about this one other than they're experimenting on children, I think, who maybe have somewhat supernatural powers. I'm not entirely sure. I'm very intrigued by it. I don't want to know more about it. I do want to kind of go into that one blind and just see what happens with it. Another one on this list is The Outsider, and I know very little about this one as well. I just know it involves a kind of upside down doppelganger version of the main character. That's all I know, and I think that's all I want to know. I think Holly Gibney is in it as well. That recurring character of his that pops up in several Stephen King books. I think she's in it as well. But other than that's all I know about The Outsider. Eyes of the Dragon. Now, my understanding about this one is that this is a hardcore fantasy written by Stephen King. And I'm just very curious to see how he does that. I'm curious if there are even dragons in it. I'm assuming there are, but who knows? But I've been curious to read this one for a while, and one of my best friends highly recommended Eyes of the Dragon to me, so I will be reading that one at some point. Firestarter is another one I'm curious about. Now, this one is a little bit more iffy for me. I don't know if I'm really interested in it, but I do want to give it a try at some point. It's not high on my priority list, it's probably way down there, but at some point I want to try it. I've never seen the movie. I think there's a couple of movies that have been made of it, and I haven't seen either one of them. Not really sure I care to. Maybe I might watch it sometime, but yeah, those aren't high on my priority list either. Different Seasons. Now, this one I definitely want to read. It's a short story collection, and I've heard that of all of his short story collections, this is one of the best ones to read. So I'm very excited to eventually pick this one up. I'm familiar with some of the short stories in there, but I'm just going to kind of go into it blind, other than knowing the names of the short stories. If It Bleeds is another one for me, and this is a big priority for me because I have this on my physical bookshelf. Yeah, I didn't get it out to show it here, but it was given to me by my son, and I really want to make that one a priority because it's been on my shelf for a couple of years now since he got it for me, and I'm like, oh, I need to read that book. I keep seeing it, and I just need to pick it up and get it done and see what it's like. I've heard If It Bleeds is pretty good, so I'm optimistic. You like it darker. I am very curious about this one. This is Stephen King's newest release. I've heard it's a really good collection of stories, so I am anxious to see what this one is like. But this is one that's not high on my priority list, so I'll get to it eventually. I want to read some of these others first. Fairy Tale is another one. I've heard mixed things about Fairy Tale, but I feel like it will be up my alley because I'm more of a fantasy reader and not as much of a horror reader or science fiction. I think as a fantasy reader, it may work very well for me. From what I understand, it may be kind of a portal fantasy of sorts. I don't know. We shall see. I will read it. And then I want to read The Dark Half. That's another one that really intrigues me by Stephen King. I don't know a whole lot about it. I've never seen the movie. I think there's a movie of it. I'm kind of going in blind, but the title is cool. I know bits and pieces about the premise. So yeah, The Dark Half is definitely on my list. And then there's some maybes. One of those is Under the Dome. Now, this kind of breaks my rule of not reading super long Stephen King books, because this is a big one. It is a very interesting premise, and so I might give it a try. I hear a lot of mixed reviews on that one, so we'll see. We'll see if I end up picking that one up. Another one is Pet Sematary. Now, I have loosely agreed to a buddy read with Fina over at Fina Reads and Danielle over at Bookcara for Pet Sematary. I don't know if I am emotionally ready to ever read Pet Sematary, but we've tentatively planned it for maybe September, October time. From what I understand, as a father and as a pet lover, the things that happen in Pet Sematary can be really excruciating emotionally. And I honestly don't know if I'm ready for that. I don't know if I want that. I am very free with my emotions, and I have a feeling that I'm going to need at least 2 tissue boxes for that book if I do end up reading it. We shall see. But from everyone that I know has read it, they've told me, Chaz, if you can't handle this stuff, don't read this book. And I'm like, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I can, but I will try. I'll at least pick the book up with my friends and try it. But I reserve the right to DNF that book. And then Needful Things. So this one is really cool. I do think that I want to read Needful Things. Again, it breaks that rule of reading longer Stephen King books. I really don't know that I want to do that, but I have heard that it's a really good book. I watched the movie on TV way back in the day when I was a lot younger, and I remember liking the movie, and I really liked Max von Sydow in the main role. So I'm curious to read the book and see what I think of it. This is another book that comes highly recommended by my best friend, and I guess we'll see what I think about that book. And then the last one on this list is Revival. I don't know a whole lot about this one other than the fact that it takes place during a set of revival meetings, Christian revival meetings, I believe. But apparently, I think the preacher has some kind of supernatural abilities to heal people and things like that. So I don't know. I could go either way on that one, but I've heard it's a very good book and a lot of people recommend it. So I may give that one a shot. So that is the end of my list. As you can see, I haven't read a ton of Stephen King, but what I have read has been very mixed between really good and not great. So even though I stated at the beginning of the video that I haven't had a really great experience with Stephen King, I'm very optimistic about going forward with some of these books. I still say I won't be a constant reader, but I do want to cherry pick some books that sound really good to me. Are there any books on this list that you think would really work for me if you've been watching my channel for a while and you know my tastes? If you think it would really work for me, let me know in the comments below. If there are books that are not on this list that you think I should also check out, please let me know. I would like to have some other recommendations, but just keep in mind, if it's a longer Stephen King book, it's less likely that I'm going to give it a shot. But please, let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear from you. And also tell me what your journey with Stephen King has been like. Are you a constant reader? Or have you kind of struggled with King's books as well? Let me know. I'd like to know if I'm alone in that or not. And until next time, guys, make sure you read more books. And I will talk with you very soon. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all my patrons. I really appreciate all your support for the channel.